Hemingway was unique in that he was a man of the outdoors and a man who went outside to get his story. There was a basis of a reporter in him. You know, during World War I, he did some reporting for daily newspapers, one in Toronto, the Toronto Globe, I think. And in his great fiction, there is a sense of veracity, a sense of time and place. You as a reader, because he was such a visual writer, you're with him. You're with him on the front in Udine in World War I. You're with him in the waters of Cuba when this fisherman is losing his great shark. You're with Hemingway in Paris. You're with Hemingway in wherever Hemingway is. You're there with him. A very, very, very compelling stylist in the most effortless, artistic way. His language is very simple, creatively simple. The sentences are very straightforward. They're driven by his poetry and his prose and his big, big vision of what he was writing about. He was a big screen writer. Fitzgerald was a more lyrical writer, a romantic writer. And so those two people, Fitzgerald and Hemingway, had a lot to do with the writers of my generation, the fiction writers. Norman Mailer, certainly influenced by Hemingway, singularly. I think James Jones, best known from Here to Eternity as a novel, but boy, he was really an apostle of Hemingway. And people of my generation, the younger people, you know, Pete Hamill and David Halberstam, and not so young, we're all in our 70s, but I mean, we're the Hemingway guys. The first level would be the Mailer, who died recently in his 80s, and Styron died, and James Jones has been dead for years. No, they were great. They were great. Those two writers were really great, and their lives, one ended in suicide, and in the case of Fitzgerald, I guess he just slowly committed suicide with his excessive drinking. He died young. Boy, what they left behind, those two guys, was great work. So the work never died. And when they were alive, they did work that lived, as they predicted probably to themselves it would, live long beyond their own years. I was influenced by Hemingway, and most writers of my generation were also influenced by him and Fitzgerald. I started as a journalist at the age of 22. I come from a small town in New Jersey called Ocean City. It's near Atlantic City. My first interest was in writing sports. As a kid, I became interested in baseball because during World War II, in 1943 and 1944, the championship New York Yankees, because of gas rationing, they couldn't train in Florida. They trained in Atlantic City. And I was born 11 miles from Atlantic City, and I was 11 years old and 12 years old in the seasons of 1943 and 44. And so when you go to spring training and you see the players being relaxed and being available for autographs, and the field itself was very small. It's like a high school baseball field, and here were the championship Yankees. Granted, it was World War II, but I was just enraptured. I was mesmerized by the scene of the big-time New York Yankees coming into the provincial areas of South Jersey, where I was born and reared. When I went to college, I thought I should take journalism. I didn't clearly define what it was about journalism that I could specialize in, but I did think sports would be the thing to do. And when I graduated in 1953, I came to New York, and I got a job as a copy boy in the New York Times. And when I finally got on the staff, after an interim period, a trainee, an intern, a flunky, which is what I was, I got to cover all sports. But I didn't really want to cover the game, whether it's a football game or a basketball game or a baseball game. I wanted to write character sketches of the people who performed. And not only the people who performed, but the people who were around the edge of the arena. For example, when I went to a prize fight, I would like to interview the fighters, and I got to know the fighters. That's true, and I wrote profiles of the fighters. It might be Floyd Patterson in those days, or Jose Torres was a great middleweight fighter. Later, Muhammad Ali, I got to know him and wrote about him, Sonny Liston. But I was equally interested in some of the characters that hung around the ring. For example, in the ring, for example, there was a guy named George, I think his name was George Backer, and his job was ringing the bell. He'd sit in Madison Square Garden, the old Madison Square Garden, the new Madison Square Garden, ringing the bell between the rounds, just ringing the bell. And went through life ringing the bell. And I thought, what an interesting way to have a living. What a career. How does this guy stand it? So I wrote this whole profile on this guy who kept time between the rounds and rang the bell. I also wrote about cut men, the guys who would fix up the battered eyes and noses of fighters. All those, baseball, I'd write about the guys that cut the grass. I mean, the groundskeepers and the head groundskeepers. I wrote about a dentist once who catered to hockey players. Hockey players would lose their teeth. They had to have special, they had mouthpieces. And I wrote about the guy who made the dentures, the dentist for the hockey team, the New York Rangers. So these are odd characters, but I thought they're really interesting, and as an interested person, I would look for that kind of story. After a couple of years, I started in 1956. About 1958, I was out of sports, writing generally about all kinds of people. And I wrote about the odd people of New York. The people, for example, who would clean out the offices of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the General Motors Building, when there was no work going on in the day. These people who would go at night and dust the desks and run their vacuum cleaners over the floors of the boardrooms and the executive suites. These women, many of them from Slavic countries, the people who took over New York at night. I would write about the people who designed mannequins of beautiful women to be put in the windows of Saks Fifth Avenue and Lord & Taylor and Bloomingdale's, the window designers. I wrote about people who cleaned the sides of the Lincoln Tunnel, the tiles, who had the job of washing those tiles and keeping the tunnel clean, the tunnel dwellers. And I wrote about people who were chauffeur drivers and what they heard in the back seats, or the doormen of hotels. I wrote a lot about doormen. And so what I'm writing about is the grandeur of New York, the big city people, but I'm also writing about how it is perceived by the people that you don't pay attention to, as doormen are not paid attention to, superintendents of buildings and what they know. And then when I started writing books, I really reflected in the background or the foreground these minor characters that are in the realm of important people, so-called. For example, one book I wrote about a mafia family, the book was called Honor Thy Father. And it's about Joe Bonanno, who was a godfather, big-style godfather in the 1960s. His son, who was about my age, was in the mafia as a lieutenant in the Bonanno crime family. It was centered in New York, but they had extensions in Canada, California, Tucson. One night in 1964, Joe Bonanno, the elder, he was in his 60s then, was walking with one of his lawyers on Lower Park Avenue, and he was kidnapped by a couple of thugs. They put him in a car, drove off. My book about that, Honor Thy Father, begins with a doorman who was standing on outside this Park Avenue South apartment house, and who saw Bonanno being pulled away by the rival mob people. And I write about the doorman, what the doorman saw, and how he reacted to it. So my way of beginning a book was not unlike the way I wrote stories when I was writing for the New York Times. Vantage point from a person who isn't directly at the center, but a little bit off. And I'm always interested in that point of view that is not the obvious vantage point. I started writing at length when I quit the Times, which was in 1965. When you work for a newspaper, you don't have much time to ponder. You're under deadline pressure. A daily paper is enormous pressure. And you also have restrictions on the amount of space. You can't write long. And I wanted to write long, and I felt frustration. Felt a lot of frustration being under daily pressure. I did have some opportunities on my days off, or once there was a long newspaper strike, and I loved the strike. It went on for months, and I had free time to write at length on the subjects I chose while the paper was on strike and we were out of work. And one of the things I did that time was write about the building of the Verrazzano Bridge. The Verrazzano Bridge between Brooklyn and Staten Island was begun in 1959 when people in both boroughs were told they had to move because roadways had to be installed and because of the bridge, and hundreds of people lost their homes. In Brooklyn, particularly in the area of Brooklyn called Bay Ridge. It's right on the lower edge of the Hudson in the Narrows. And Staten Island, too, many people were forced to move, and there's a lot of protesting. In 1960, the bridge starts to go up. The engineers, the construction workers, the barge tenders. Steel was brought in. Slowly you saw the two towers emerging from the lower level of the Hudson River and going 600 feet into the sky, and then steel was spun from one tower to the other, setting up the structure that would cause the cables to take form. And each day I would go during this strike, and I'd watch 600 men at high altitude swinging from the cables, doing riveting, doing hammering, putting things in place. There were barges below, and the barges would, with the help of machinery, hoist the high levels of the sky overlooking what would be the deck, chunks of steel, and they were interlocked. It was just a beautiful thing to see how a bridge, step by step, is built. And more interesting was to get to know the rather anonymous group of people, numbering 100, about 600 people were full-time workers, who they were, and I got to know them in their off hours, and on weekends I would go with them to where they lived. And some of these people were Indians. They were from Canada, specialized in high aerial work. And I'd go to the reservation along the St. Lawrence River with these Indians. They were a mixed breed of Mohawks. Fascinating guys. I'd hang out with them. And so I wrote this book called The Bridge. And it was a building of the Verrazzano, but it was from the vantage point of people whose names you would never know. You know, people who more than 100 years ago built the Brooklyn Bridge. We don't know who these people are. So it behooved me that when I got an opportunity to write about living bridge builders, people I could talk to and write their names and get their stories and how they became bridge builders. And most of them were the sons of bridge builders and the grandsons of bridge builders. There were people I knew on this Verrazzano project in the 1960s who had fathers who helped build the George Washington Bridge in the 1930s, uptown Manhattan. So whether father to son or grandfather to grandson, a lot of interlinkage between the families that link the steel to build a bridge. But what I do as a writer is try to capture in nonfiction, meaning reality, using real names to tell stories. When I tell stories, I do a lot of research before I do the writing. Sometimes it will take me 2 or 3 or 4 years to research a subject. Because I'm not a specialist. I don't write the same thing. I'm not like a historian who writes about Civil War or World War II or the banking industry. I change subjects all the time. I told you I read about bridge building. I wrote about gangsters. Another book I wrote about, which is a book I know a lot about, was the newspaper business. I wrote a long book about the New York Times. I wrote a long book about sexuality. It's called Thy Neighbor's Wife, and the research I did beginning in 1970 and it continued into 1980. I worked in massage parlors. I lived as a nudist in California. I was doing this whole study of what was considered obscene in America. And if you're going to write about obscenity in America or the changing definition of morality, what was considered immoral in 1940 was not considered immoral in 1970 when I started this research. So I was really interested in how things change in American life and how the definition of what is sinful also changes, because I was raised a Catholic, and as a kid I was an altar boy, taught in parochial school. in the southern town of New Jersey I told you about, Ocean City. And the idea of what would send you to hell in 1940 changed in 1970. In American theater, you could see nudity on the stage in the 1970s. Never would you imagine that in the 1940s and 50s. Magazines, same thing, nudity, Playboy and the Imitators. You also had language, what put Lenny Bruce in jail in the 1960s and 50s for his profanity in public, the way he spoke, the use of his language. In 1970s, 80s, what convicted Lenny Bruce, who was then dead, allowed many, many performers to appear even on television, cable television, granted, but it's amazing how things changed. And in 1960s and 70s, we have the emergence of homosexual life gradually coming out of the closet. We have books that had been pornography now allowed to be on public libraries and sold in bookstores. So I wrote about that, Thy Neighbor's Wife. And I finished that book in 1980. It's a very controversial book. But just now, speaking to you in 2009, I brought that book up to date as I did the Bridge book. I wondered what happened since I finished the book. And that's one of the things I've always done. I finish something. It might be a magazine piece or it might be a book, but I don't stop. I'm not finished with the people I wrote about. I want to know what happened to them since I finished writing about them. What happened to them since the book was published or the article was published. My longest magazine pieces, some of them, for example, Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. It took me 3 months. Started with me going out to California, hanging around with some of the people who worked with Sinatra, watching Sinatra try to record for NBC, watching Sinatra sing to a live audience as opposed to television audience, watching Sinatra while he was attending a fight in Las Vegas, Muhammad Ali annihilating Floyd Patterson, for example. I saw that fight in 1966. And then I finished the research. I went out to New Jersey to talk to Frank Sinatra's mother and his father. I talked to his daughters, Nancy and Tina, and the other son, Frank Sinatra Jr. And I finished the research, and then I came home to New York. In my little studio, I started, how am I going to tell this story? I had organized my material. How does it begin? Where do I go from there? How do I end this thing? What am I trying to say? How do I bring it together? Because sometimes your research is very, it's a massive material that you have to know how to shape. It's like a sculptor, I guess, has all this clay or stone, and you have to chisel it. You have to get some shape to it. It has to have a kind of form, a direction. It's like choreography. You have to go step by step by step. How do you move through this prose? So I wrote this piece about Frank Sinatra. It's called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. Actually, he did have a cold, and one of the reasons I had just such a tough time with him, he wouldn't even talk to me. One reason, he was not feeling well. And another reason, getting back to the mafia, when I first started with him, the lawyer said, listen, we're worried you're going to link Sinatra with the mafia. I said, I'm not going to do that. Well, we heard, you know mafia people, and also we were worried about Walter Cronkite, that guy at CBS. He's supposed to be doing a news show, and Sinatra's alleged connections to people in Las Vegas, or connections to Reno, or connections to Chicago, Sammy Giancana, and all that. I said, listen, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. Well, we have to be sure. We want to see what you write before you publish it. I said, wow, I can't do that. I can't have you see this before. I mean, it has to go straight to the editor. I'm not writing for you guys. Well, if you're not writing for us, maybe you shouldn't write at all. Well, listen, I'm going to do this. I have an assignment. I had to sign with Esquire. But, really, I had a standoff here. So, actually, Sinatra didn't talk to me. And when he wasn't talking to me, I was kind of talking to the people around him. Now, I'm not saying they were his most close, confidential friends, but there were a lot of people who knew Sinatra. He'd made a lot of movies. There are a lot of actors in those movies. Maybe they weren't major actors, but they were people who had a scene with Sinatra or worked with Sinatra. They might have been directors. They might have been band leaders. They might have been third trumpeters in some orchestra. They might have been someone who was in the chorus while he sang. And all these people, hundreds and hundreds, knew Sinatra to a degree. And I talked to those so-called minor characters and got a major story. So when the lawyer for Sinatra says, you know, if you don't submit it to us, we're not going to help you, we're not going to cooperate. Well, I didn't need it because I had these other, there's some of my tradition of dealing with people who are not very important turned out to serve me well. Served me well because I could get stories from people who had things to tell me, but I sought them out because I thought they're relevant people. They're not nobodies, they are somebody. And so the piece worked out. It took me 3 months. Now when I started writing books as opposed to magazine profiles, it would take me, well, the book on Thy Neighbor's Wife took me 10 years because I had to, first of all, do reporting, the same kind of reporting I do, whether it's bridge building, whether it's mafia chasing, whether it's media writing, like on the book on the New York Times, or whether it's a book about morality or immorality, which is what Thy Neighbor's Wife is all about. I hang around with immoral people. I befriend them. I take them to lunch, like I did with gangsters, like I did with newspapers, like I did with bridge builders. Hanging out. It's the art of hanging out. It's not getting things secondhand, third. It's being there. Now, when you're hanging around with people who are supposedly obscene, or some of them actually were defined obscene. Some of them went to jail for obscenity. I mean, Lenny Bruce, I mentioned before. But now I'm talking about the period post-Bruce, the after Bruce. He's dead. I'm talking about the 1970s, into the late 70s and early 80s. People like, like Al Goldstein. Now, he's not a name that might strike familiarity with your audience, but he was the publisher of a magazine called Screw. It's actually a newspaper, once a week newspaper. And he was always being arrested for obscenity, publishing obscenity, go to jail, lawyers would bail him out. I hung around with him a lot because he was of the literary underground. He was representing the level of licentiousness, the level below which journalism was not supposed to descend, the level of offensiveness worthy of being prosecuted. So this guy, Al Goldstein, was in and out of jail all the time. I knew him. I go to visit him in jail. But he was a perfect guy for me because he was, in a way, a sinner in the literary community, disgraceful person, never would be invited to a journalism luncheon, never win a Pulitzer Prize, never be nominated, because he was considered the scourge of the earth, underground. You know, he was in purgatory, if not hell, in the minds of many people, including people in the media. He was just my perfect guy, because I wanted to see, from his point of view, how he saw the world. I wanted to get from him his rationale for dealing with what was considered licentious and obscene. I went to the Supreme Court in Washington and watched these cases, watched obscenity cases, watched the defense attorneys argue with the members of the court, try to defend their client as being part of the public's right to know. Even obscenity is a right to know. Or even obscenity has a kind of validity about it because it defines the life of the mind, even if it's perverted, even if it's perhaps in any definition that's contemporary, is obscene. And I was interested in that. I went out to California to a place called Sandstone, where there's a whole nudist community. Hundreds of people belonged to this community located in Topanga Canyon, overlooking, in Southern California, overlooking Malibu Beach. And I spent 6 months living with those people and writing about it. So I had no clothes on. I was living among nudists I was living as a nudist, writing about the nudists and the swingers at night. And there are scenes in Thy Neighbor's Wife that really are very specific, very, very precisely described, are very scenic, are very visual. Because I do look at life and I look at what I'm writing in a visual sense. And that book was published. It was an outrageous publication. People thought it was terrible. The book was not banned. It wasn't banned, but it was certainly tarnished my whatever reputation I had prior to that. My book in the New York Times had been a bestseller. My book on the Mafia had been a bestseller. Other works of mine had been respected, won some prizes. When this book came out, like my whole life before that was in question. I was in question. I was married, I had 2 daughters, and the ridicule that came upon me for venturing into the world of obscenity, and living with and associating with and intermingling with the obscene, the pornographic, the disgusting, the disreputable, the perverse and perverted. I was mixing in that world, but I was writing with accuracy, with credibility, and with reliability on this wretched world that some people thought better you don't even deal with it. So writing is a way of knowing, and with writing is exploring. And the kind of work I do, which is reality writing, nonfiction writing, investigative writing, journalistic writing, but also could be literary writing. And it could be historically important too, because if you're dealing with things with your own eyes, your own sensibility, you're bringing to whoever it is or whatever it is you're writing about, be it construction of a bridge, or the desecration of a mafia family, or the desecration of the World Trade Center, or the deviations of a pornographic publisher. Whatever it is, you're adding to information that is part of history, the history of your time, the time in which you are alive to explore, to understand, and finally to put on paper what it is that you think you know that is truthful about people and places. And that's what I've been doing. I don't care what writer we're talking about. The way they write and what they write, who they choose to write about, or what they choose to write of themselves, is very much connected to who they are, where they come from, their family origins. And no less true is it in my case. That's how I go about my work. I'm trying to find people with whom I have shared sentiments, or who have gone through what I've gone through, or my curiosity is really not only based on what I want to know about them, but I want to know how I relate to that. And I'm writing in a way from someone with whom I have compatibility. When I wrote about the Bonanno crime family, well, I wasn't ever in the mafia. I never had a criminal record. But the people who had a criminal record, those Italian, Sicilian mobsters, were born and reared ancestrally in the same place where my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were born and reared. They're all from southern Italy, the tip of Italy. It could be Sicily, which is the island off the toe of the boot, or Calabria, which is the first part as you go to the mainland that you encounter when you come over from Sicily. It's Calabria. The book that I wrote, Honor Thy Father, was to try to understand how my father was different from Bill Bonanno's father, the illustrious or notorious Joe Bonanno, and try to understand why Bill Bonanno chose to go into his father's business when he had a college education. Why did he have to go in the mafia? The wife of Bill Bonanno told me, she said, you know, here's a kid that grew up to honor his father, as good Catholics were taught, and he winds up in jail most of the time. That was a good choice, she said. She was bitter. I mean, I could understand she was bitter. But Honor Thy Father, I thought that's a perfect title. It came out of her mouth. The title of the New York Times book, called The Kingdom and the Power, was appropriate in that the kingdom and the power of the New York Times was sort of like a religious institution in the days when I first joined the paper in 1953 when I was a copy boy. If they considered themselves, they who ran the New York Times and worked in the New York Times, rather like monks in a monastery. They were scriveners. They were writing for the record. They were writing for history. They were keeping in a civilized form the chronicles of the daily life of the civilization. Now, I wouldn't say that's true of journalism today, but the Kingdom of the Power had a kind of legitimacy about it as a title when I wrote that book in 1969, published in 69. Thy Neighbor's Wife, that was my title. I thought it was great because you're dealing with adultery, you're dealing with pornography, you're dealing with all kinds of behavior that was considered of questionable legitimacy and maybe outright immorality. Thy Neighbor's Wife. And I thought, you know, no matter what class of people you're looking at, there's always going to be the strays, the people who are the sinners. And I published that book in, as I said before, in 1980. And then there was a kind of a movement after that under the administration of Richard Nixon, Reagan, to kind of clean up America's Times Square. They cleaned up Times Square. It used to be a grill. The red light district of the Tenderloin of Manhattan was right there. 42nd Street, 8th Avenue to 43rd, 44, massage parlors, 4 X-rated movies, Deep Throat, all that stuff was featured. Then Giuliani gets in there, and Bloomberg gets in there. They clean all that up. What did they clean up? What did they clean up? I mean, there's still, in politics, we have nothing but scandal. The governor of New York is thrown out of office because he's online with an escort service. He has sex, professional sex, married man with children. Governor of New Jersey's got a boyfriend. He has to leave office. The new governor replacing Spitzer, Patterson, he goes, first thing he does when he's appointed as successor, he admits, at least he's honest about it, he admits having had an affair with his wife. And his wife admits that she had an affair too when she was sort of not feeling so good about the husband she was married to. And then you have this poor Senator Craig, this guy in Minneapolis airport, he's got his gesturing with his feet in ways that cause him to be arrested for sort of homosexual solicitation. I mean, this country in 2008, 2009, 2007 was just as rampantly sexual as during the sexual revolution that I wrote about in great length in Thy Neighbor's Wife. So in this new book, new edition of Thy Neighbor's Wife coming out in 2009 had a sort of an ad, well, what went on? What's going on now? So this country has always been a mixture of a kind of puritanical republic, very religious, and lusty and rampant. As somebody, Mr. Stengel, the editor-in-chief of Time magazine, Richard Stengel, wrote, Americans want it both ways. You know, paraphrasing him, he said, we want to present ourselves as upstanding, pious, God-fearing, biblical people, people of the Word, people believe in morality. We read the Bible, we go to church. You know. On the other hand, we have that Saturday night side. We say one thing and we do another. It's just mass hypocrisy. But it's not only sexuality that manifests itself in hypocritical ways. Our foreign policy is also the same. You know, we profess to be democratic and we're not. We profess to be for human rights and we go in and wreck the society in Iraq, treat the Cuban people in the worst way for a half a century because they don't knuckle under. We are very autocratic. We say we're democratic, autocratic, full of hypocrisy. We want to blame people for human rights violations. And boy, the foreign policy of this country, at least during the whole period of President Bush, was filled with doing one thing and saying another and covering up our atrocities in prison camps where we torture people, lying to the public and lying to the press. That's how we got into this Iraq war in 2003. All of it coming out of presumably the justification being the 2001 attack on September 11th. But now I think I feel better about the country. I speak to you now in the early days of the Barack Obama administration. I hope that much will change from the past, because America at least has a new face. That's great. We have a new face. And perhaps this new face and this new force for change will convince the world that the America that has existed prior to the election of Barack Obama, that world is going to change too. And the image of Americans will not be one of meddlesomeness and hypocrisy and deceit and lying, which is so much a part of the recent past.